were standing in long queues to just collect essentials, food, etc. There were power cuts, long queues, and the suffering of the people led to a popular uprising against the regime, and which resulted in the resignation of both the Prime Minister and the President and appointment of a new leader. And the IMF bailout came in, and with that promise of the IMF bailout, imports, food and fuel started coming back in, and a restructuring process was introduced. And now the economy is recovering and things are moving in the right direction. Now this is sort of the gist of the mainstream perspective that is promoted by the IMF, the Sri Lankan government, Western governments, media, NGOs and others. But this approach is very limited. Obviously, it leaves out the geopolitical and historical contexts of the crisis. And in my book, I go into great detail, and as I said, I would only give a brief overview here. But one thing I do want to emphasize is that debt, which is at the center of the current economic crisis, is not some neutral, straightforward number, but an outcome of power relations. That debt has to be understood historically in relation to colonialism and neocolonialism as an expression of unequal power relations. Now, in this regard, it's important to note that Sri Lanka has had the longest historical experience of colonialism of any country in Asia, starting with the Portuguese in 1505, followed by the Dutch and then the British, who conquered the entire island in 1815. And both colonial and neo-colonial rule could not have continued and cannot continue without the collusion of local economic and political elite. So it is not entirely an external process. It is a combination of external and internal factors working together. To understand current problems with regard to foreign exchange shortage and difficulty of importing essential goods, we need to understand unequal integration of the Sri Lankan economy into the global capitalist economy. I've discussed this at length in my first book, Colonialism in Sri Lanka, and I will just emphasize here that we need to understand the dynamics of the import-export economy that was set in place in order to understand the current situation. Now, based on theories of comparative advantage, ideologies of progress, development, modernization, etc., local self-sufficient economies were turned into exporters of resources and importers of goods from the metropolitan imperialist countries. And this is not something that was peculiar to Sri Lanka. This is what happened with colonialism around the world. So local economies became net importers of food. But from the beginning, that the system of exchange that was set in place was one of inequality to the disadvantage of the colonies. The natural resources and labor of the colonies were undervalued, and those of the imperialist countries were overvalued. And this system of unequal exchange has essentially continued in the post-independence era, including today, but of course taking new forms and shapes. So again, the current crisis has to be understood in this historical and geopolitical context. And just to give one example of the extent of unequal exchange, the value transfer is actually from the global south to the global north rather than the other way around, as it is often assumed. For example, between 1980 and 2017, the so-called developing countries paid out $42 trillion solely in interest payments. That is way more than any aid that they received from the developed countries. So today, over 60 other countries, the debt crisis is not peculiar to Sri Lanka, over 60 countries are in debt crisis or near debt crisis around the world. And the numbers are growing even according to IMF projections. As Debt Justice, which is an NGO, and other organizations point out, these debt crises are the result of global political, economic, and financial architecture rather than simply local corruption or mismanagement as it is often thought to be. And in this regard, I think we have to look at the fact that high food prices are not so much due to supply and demand problems, but due to price speculation in highly financialized commodity markets. And today, a handful of the largest asset management companies, especially BlackRock, control very large shares in companies in all sectors of production in the world, from food and agriculture to pharmaceuticals to media to defense. So the financialization of the global economy has reverberating effects around the world, including in Sri Lanka. So especially with corporate deregulation and neoliberal policies and the financialization that accompanied them, more and more of sectors and people's lives have come to be controlled by the top echelons of the financial capital pyramid. International sovereign bonds and commercial borrowing at high interest rates actually lie behind the Sri Lankan crisis. BlackRock is the biggest ISB creditor to Sri Lanka, and 81% of the current foreign debt, which is over 50 billion, is held by the West and its allies rather than by China, as it is often assumed. So with regard to this particular corporate and financial dominance, we also have to recognize that global financial institutions, notably at the IMF and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, remain outside political and legal control without even elementary accountability. Another very important thing to recognize is the enormous wealth concentration and deepening inequality that has accompanied neoliberalism and dominance of finance capital. According to Oxfam, a well-reputed NGO, the top 1% of the income earners in the world control more wealth than the rest of the 99% put together. So Sri Lanka has now gone into a bailout economic restructuring program with the IMF, and Sri Lanka would receive 2.9 billion from the IMF over a 48-month period. Now that 2.9 billion is actually quite minuscule compared to the totality of the debt, the foreign debt that Sri Lanka owes. But the conditions that have been placed on Sri Lanka are quite stringent. Sri Lanka, the state, has to cut back on expenses and increase revenue. And to do so, one of the things that the government has been doing is raising tariffs, like electricity, water tariffs on the population, and also adding a value, what is called a VAT, a value-added tax of 18% on all manner of goods and services, including essentials. And this kind of universal taxation falls most heavily on the poorest segments of the population, so much so that in the last few months alone, 1 million people have lost access to electricity because they're not able to pay the increased taxes. Children are not able to study at night because they don't have electricity. Small and medium businesses have had to close down because they cannot afford to pay the increased tariffs. In addition, there have been cutbacks on subsidies to the agricultural sector, fertilizer and other subsidies, and agricultural production is experiencing massive setback. And another thing that is happening on a very large scale is, in the name of increasing state revenue, And in the name of curtailing inefficiency and corruption, state-owned enterprises are being privatized left and right. And these include Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, Ceylon Electricity Board, maritime ports, airports are all being privatized and handed over to private interests, mostly of foreign powers. And some of them, like the Ceylon Electricity Board, are profit-making enterprises. So it's a sort of indiscriminate privatization that is going on in the name of raising funds. But handing over very strategic sectors like telecom and energy to private private groups and foreign powers creates grave threats to national security and sovereignty of the country. In addition to threats to livelihoods, because a lot of people are being laid off in the course of privatization. So since the crisis, over 1 million people, now this is a small country with about a population of about 21 million, over 1 million people have already left the country. So the brain drain is massive, and most of the people who are leaving are young professionals. And they are actually being encouraged to leave. The process of getting a passport has been speeded up. And in some of the hospitals, you can't find an anesthesiologist because the doctors are leaving. The engineers are leaving in massive numbers. So it leads to a kind of a breakdown of the economy and the society. So there have been cutbacks in social expenditure, the renowned health and education sectors of Sri Lanka. And the World Bank itself is showing that nearly 28% of the population is under the official poverty line. Malnutrition is increasing, and the economic disparity within the country is also increasing. I'm not giving all the statistics here because they are in my book. So Sri Lanka has actually gone to the IMF 16 times prior to this time in 2022. And what becomes clear when you look at the whole historical trajectory of IMF restructuring is that the objective is not necessarily to liberate countries from the vicious debt cycle, but to keep them trapped in the debt cycle, to push for export production and the import of essentials, and to keep them borrowing from financial markets, especially capital markets. So there is an emphasis away from improving local production, particularly agriculture. So Sri Lanka, however, unfortunately, is not only experiencing economic subordination, but it is also experiencing victimization due to geopolitical rivalry. And I think we can't separate the two aspects, the economic and the political, and that's what I'll try to do in the book, see how they are really intertwined. Given its strategic position in the heart of the Indian Ocean, in the East-West maritime trade routes, Sri Lanka has long been subjected to external political intervention and rivalry. I mentioned, the Western colonialism. There was, intense fighting over Trincomalee Harbour, which is a strategic natural harbour on the eastern province. In the current period, Sri Lanka has been caught in the struggle between China on the one hand and US and India on the other. Now, Sri Lanka, like many other countries around the world, is now party to the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative of China. So China has now gotten a 99-year lease for the Hambantota port in the southwest. It's owned the Colombo port city, a terminal in the Colombo port, and other infrastructural projects. So, fearing this expansion of Chinese power over Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean region and the world at large, the US and its allies launched the Indo-Pacific strategy to curb Chinese expansion, especially in the Indian Ocean, making Sri Lanka the center of the Indo-Pacific strategy and of also what is known as the Quadrilateral Alliance to curb Chinese expansion. And the Quadrilateral Alliance constitutes the USA, India, Japan, and Australia. And what's interesting is now there's more evidence coming out that the 2022 April default and the foreign exchange crisis were actually staged to move Sri Lanka away from Chinese dominance into the IMF, US, Indian credit lines. Now this can be very controversial, but it's certainly worth exploring because it's shown that Sri Lanka did not necessarily have to declare default in April 2022 because it had access to bilateral loans, including from China at that point. However, there was pressure put on the country to do so for political reasons. So again, the economic crisis needs to be seen within the context of this geopolitical rivalry, which is why it makes it so intense in the case of Sri Lanka. So the regime that came into power following the so-called Aragalia protest was much closer to the West than the previous Rajapaksa regime that was considered allied with China, although all these regimes have been working with all these different foreign powers. Nevertheless, what's important to see is that this new regime, or the leadership of it, was rejected by the electorate and is not a democratically elected regime with a popular mandate that is in power right now. Nevertheless, they are going forth with a lot of policies which have tremendous implications for Sri Lanka politically, economically, and strategically. So the economic crisis and the change of power dynamics has paved the way for change in external power dynamics, with India and the USA aggressively asserting themselves over the island. So India came to Sri Lanka's rescue during the height of the crisis with bilateral loans, which were gratefully acknowledged and which were very helpful at that time. Nevertheless, it has leveraged its influence to its maximum advantage since the crisis to financially, economically, politically, and even culturally dominate Sri Lanka. And I'm just going to summarize a few aspects of this without going into detail. Apparently, there have been 5 pacts signed with India in recent, since the new regime was put in place, in secrecy without discussion in the parliament. The Indian imports and the dependence on Indian imports have soared. UPI, the Unified Payments Interface, has been introduced to Sri Lanka, which would also facilitate the use of the Indian rupee for transaction in Sri Lanka. There are discussions of signing a bilateral trade treaty with India, which in shorthand is referred to as ECTA, which would be favorable to India. And there's even the talk of physically linking the two countries through a bridge linking Sri Lanka with India. So preference has been given to Indian companies in the privatization process as well. For example, in the establishment of a petroleum power line from India to Sri Lanka, linked with India's power grid, a wind turbine project in Mannar, control of the airports, the west terminal of the Colombo port, are being offered to the controversial Adani group. Already Trincomalee Harbour and the oil tanks, the so-called oil tank farms, they are Indian controlled. So there's a lot of issues that come up here. India as well as China are part of the BRICS that represent an alternative to dollar domination, which has been a major aspect of debt crises around the world, that countries being forced to pay in dollars. And the floating of alternative currencies is an alternative to the unipolar model that USA represents. But nevertheless, are the BRICS following the same model of profit, power, and domination, particularly vis-a-vis smaller countries like Sri Lanka? So that's not a question for which there are easy answers, but nevertheless, I think we have to raise those questions rather than simply saying, oh, but there's BRICS. So let's say the USA, again, I don't have time to go into great detail. There was a pact called the Millennium Challenge Cooperation Compact that the USA was trying very hard to get Sri Lanka to sign. But because of popular protest, it wasn't signed, but many of its strategic goals are being carried out. And one of them is the privatization of state-owned land. And this again is very controversial, because if state-owned land that is held by small farmers are privatized and commoditized, put in the market, many of these poverty-stricken farmers are going to sell that land, and it will fall into private hands. And whose hands will it fall into? Transnational corporations, external powers? Are the farming class going to be dispossessed? Again, lots of questions there. Military pacts have been signed with the United States, including AXA, this is prior to the current crisis, in 2017, Acquisition and Cross-Service Agreement, which makes Sri Lanka the main supply hub for US armed forces in the Indo-Pacific. It makes Sri Lanka a US military logistics hub. Also, so far, Status of Forces Agreement has been signed, although some say it has not been signed. Again, it's all in secrecy. It's not said openly whether it has been signed or not. But if signed, it allows the US military control over the country, in the sense that it can use the Sri Lanka as a military base, which allows US military personnel in uniform to carry arms, and they would be above the Sri Lankan law. It wouldn't require them to have visas, etc., to enter the country. Now, recently, the US ambassador to Sri Lanka has confirmed that the US has plans for further use of Sri Lanka as a US logistics hub and military base, not only for the Indian Ocean but beyond. And this is interesting because very recently, like last month, Sri Lankan Navy has deployed a former US Coast Guard cutter in the Red Sea to deter the Houthi rebels who are blocking maritime trade in support of the Palestinian struggle. A lot of Western countries refuse to support this effort led by the United States to block the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea and the adjoining areas. But Sri Lanka has gone ahead with supporting that. So it raises questions about, is Sri Lanka really doing this on its own? You know, its implications for sovereignty, etc. So, to try to wrap all this up, I think it's important to recognize that Sri Lanka is not just an island unto itself, but has been peopled by immigrants and shaped by external influences from time immemorial. So it is not an argument for against any kind of external intervention, because we live in a globalized world. There is international exchange, but there are also larger issues about sovereignty, independence, etc. So in spite of its size, Sri Lanka has maintained a distinctive cultural identity, economic self-sufficiency, and political sovereignty over the centuries. The pre-colonial history was characterized by long drawn-out struggles against invasions from India, and in the periods of Western colonialism, there were continued resistance against the plantation economy imposed by the British taxation policies, land policies, educational and religious, and other introductions. I discuss many of these in my book, Colonialism in Sri Lanka. Now, following political independence from the British in 1948, Sri Lanka, like many other ex-colonies, underwent a period of political and economic decolonization, especially from the 1950s to the 1970s. There were attempts, not only in Sri Lanka but around the world, to establish economic self-sufficiency and autonomy through nationalization of foreign-owned companies, import substitution efforts, and establishment of an array of SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And many of the enterprises that are being privatized today were actually established during that period of decolonization, including the Petroleum Corporation, the Ceylon Electricity Board, etc. Another thing that is really important to recognize with regard to Sri Lanka is that associated with decolonization, electoral democracy, as well as nationalist and left struggles, Sri Lanka developed a welfare state, with the state providing support for health, education, transport, etc., which resulted in very high quality of life indices for Sri Lanka, especially compared to other countries in South Asia and in Asia. So in terms of GNP, Sri Lanka was a underdeveloped country, but in terms of literacy, high literacy rates, low infant mortality, high life expectancy, Sri Lanka was a rich country, more developed in that sense than China, India, any of these other countries put together. And this was in the mid-1970s. So it is this highly functioning country that is very quickly now sort of being impoverized. So, but Sri Lanka was not alone in the effort to break out of the colonial dependency model. Ex-colonies in Latin America, Asia, Africa, all were calling for a new international economic order through organizations like UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, calling for better terms of trade for the third world vis-a-vis the developed countries. I have some of the declarations on the NIEO as an appendix in my book. And Sri Lanka, though a small country, was a leader in this global effort. So economic nationalism and also challenging the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and the World Bank, free trade, so-called free trade agreements, export-led model of growth were all part of this call for a new international economic order. But unfortunately, and of course there were problems with that effort, there were mistakes, there were inefficiencies, so on and so forth. But nevertheless, there was a lot of pressure against these countries going on their own independent paths of development. So these countries were really blocked in terms of models, developing their models of economic development, nationalist development, and then came the neoliberalism models for corporate deregulation, greater push for export production, and to keep these countries within the expanding globalized capitalist economy. Now, in addition to the economic front, there was also leadership on the part of Sri Lanka on the political front with its role in the non-aligned movement, calling for the right of countries to stay clear of the Cold War at the time between the United States and the Soviet Union, the superpower struggle. And Sirimavu Bandaranaike, who was the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka at that time, who was also the first female Prime Minister in the modern world, was a champion of the rights of self-determination and economic nationalism, as well as the call for the Indian Ocean to be demilitarized. Now in 1971, Sri Lanka, along with India and other countries of the non-aligned movement, passed a declaration on the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace, which was adopted by the UN in 1971. And that is more relevant today than ever, given the rapid militarization of the Indian Ocean. Because in the Indian Ocean, there are constant maritime exercises called Malabar exercises on the part of the US and India, surveillance ships traversing the Indian Ocean, Chinese ships. So there is a lot of military activities that are not often brought into the mainstream understanding. So, as I said, the call for Indian Ocean, demilitarization of the Indian Ocean, is more relevant than ever today, as Sri Lanka is turned into a military logistics hub and a surveillance hub for especially US military exercises. So, just to say a few things to wrap up, Sri Lanka, although poverty-stricken and desperate right now, is a country with abundant resources. It's actually a very rich country with plenty of water and a rich soil, vegetation, resilient population, and a history of one of the highly complex hydraulic civilizations in the world, which is a marvel in the world, and a culture that preserved the environment and also the Buddhist teaching for the rest of the world. In recent years too, there have been massive local protests by environmental union and other activists against the Chinese-controlled Hambantota port and the port city, against Indian control of the strategic Trincomalee Harbour and other interventions, against the MCC Compact, AXA, SOFA agreements with the United States. And in fact, the election of the Rajapaksas back into power in 2019-2020 was partly as expression of opposition to increased international intervention. Although once in power, they did not necessarily hold up the nationalist mandate. So to conclude, I would say that the crisis in Sri Lanka is not just a crisis of Sri Lanka's alone. It is part of an ongoing existential struggle for people and the planet, for the right to political and economic and cultural sovereignty and self-determination, and the protection of the environment. And in spite of the prevailing dominant narrative, people are waking up to the destructive nature of the dominant techno-capitalist paradigm and calling or recognizing the need for partnership and a more ecological paradigm. So if there is hope, the hope lies in education and awareness of people and in people coming together across ethno-religious and political party differences to safeguard the environment and humanity, people, both in Sri Lanka and the world. So I will stop there and take questions and comments.